Good morning and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. So great to see so many folks here on this chilly January morning. I think it finally remembered what month it was, because it was in the 60s last week. That was really nice.
I know, it's hard.
I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Patrick in just a minute, but I have a couple of announcements. First, I was trying to remember your honorific. I couldn't remember if you were a doctor or not. So
No,
yeah. There's a
old,
lot of doctors and reverend doctors
plain
and
old
just reverends
yeah.
around here, so it's hard to keep track sometimes. Excuse our witty banter. So a couple of announcements. Pastor Patrick will be our speaker this morning. For the rest of January, we are going to be hearing from Professor of Religious Studies at George Mason, Dr. John Barclay Burns. He will be speaking to us about the exile of ancient Israel. So if you remember our Desert and Dialogue speaker, Martine Halverson Taylor, he's going to kind of pick up where she left off. So the exile, the diaspora after the Babylonian conquest. So he will be speaking with us for the next 3 weeks, starting next week. We are going to have separately, we are going to have a mental health first aid training in February. This is February 24th, which is a Friday. It's an all-day event. We are going to, we're hosting this event put on by a nonprofit that, if you think about first aid, you know, how to administer medicine, how to, you know, administer Band-Aids, things like that. But think about that for mental health. This is open to 30 people. So a small group will be meeting in this room. Lunch will be provided. It's from 9:30 to 5 that Friday. It is.
Why am I not hearing anything?
Registration fee. If you have any questions, please let me know. If you know of anybody who might be interested, please let me know and I can reach out to them.
What was the date again?
The 24th of February, which is a Friday. Information is also in the e-gram and in today's bulletin, if you would like to take that home with you. So those are my couple of announcements. And so like I said, it's so great to be with you all. And for the folks online, we're going to go ahead and get started. You ready?
Sure did, yeah.
All right, welcome, Reverend Patrick.
Morning, everyone. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
These are faces I haven't seen yet, maybe this year, and some new faces. Welcome to everyone here. With Rebecca's introduction, I think the theme of my class is it only gets better after this. There's only, nowhere to go but up. It sounds like a really good program. But it's fun to see all of you, and it's fun to do what we're going to do together, even though you know, today's a full day here in the life of the church. And so in preparing for this class, we wanted to honor where we are, the range of emotions and the range of things that we're encountering today with Whitney's being with us for the last time in this capacity. So we need to be reliant on each other, reliant on the Spirit that has brought us together. So let's take a moment and have some prayer. Lord, you hold it all together. You hold the pages of this text, this scripture, this sacred body of work together in all of its promise and contradiction and challenge. You hold this world together. A day where the sun shines in some places, and on a day when the torrents pour, or there's dryness and aridness. You hold all of that together. And you hold each of us together as a community of faith, as those who are on firm foundations of faith and understanding, and those who are seeking, trying to understand, those who are grieving, those who are in a place of rejoicing, those for whom today is a day where we may run and walk, and for those for whom this is a harder challenge. And I just pray that you would hold us together in this time of learning and exploration through the words of the gospel that we'll explore together, and lead us into worship or from it and into the day and the week ahead as we encounter and share this new year of promise and opportunity. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so this is actually a first for me in how many years I've been here. I don't know that I've tried to do or done a good old-fashioned Bible study with Larry and his survey courses of the Old and New Testament. Perhaps it's just been like, oh, well, he's got that covered, and he's got that covered very well. But in thinking about what we might do together in this time, and Rebecca and I knew that this would be I don't call it a one-off, but this isn't part of a series, just an opportunity for us to be together today. I thought, well, let's take some time and open up a particular text. And what the text I've chosen for us today is from Luke, though there are parallels in other gospels, and we're going to get to that shortly. And it's the parable, quote unquote, of the new wineskins, or you could call it the parable of the old wine, or you could call it the parable of the garments. I think what we call a text says something about what we're taking from it. And so we don't have to take the title that is given, the parable of the new wineskins. We can give it our own title. I chose this because the newness of the new year, in part. How many of you have set a new intention for the year, or at least thought about setting a new intention, a new resolution for the year? Yeah, so some grimaces, some like, I'm one or so weeks into mine, and I'm so far so good. But it's, if history proves correct, if you ask me in February, I might need another nudge. But we're in the new season, and a friend of mine who's Hindu by background, he texted me over the holiday, and he had two questions. One was to explain the Trinity, which was like, oh, okay, how to do that by text message. But he also asked a question that I've never been asked before, which was, why do Christians not celebrate New Year's as a Christian holiday? Certainly there are themes of newness throughout Scripture, and we'll come to that. Jesus didn't celebrate the New Year as we would. Presumably he celebrated the Jewish New Year. But newness is something that we're all encountering in this season. I thought it would be helpful to do that. But another reason is that it's a challenging text. And it may not seem like a challenging text when we start to look at it initially. But I'm always drawn in when I'm presented an opportunity to study a certain text, maybe preach it. If I have the courage, I tend to gravitate towards the ones that I don't completely have my head around. When I was in seminary, we have to do a big exegesis paper, looking at Rebecca again, and it might cause her to say, that's a terrible word. But a big paper interpreting a particular text, and I remember choosing one where Jesus basically rebukes the Canaanite woman and makes some. You could say he makes an equivalent. He calls her a dog, and that's troubling. So I made a point of studying that. This text is not quite so, at least on the face of it, challenging. But there's a lot of contradiction and involved, and there's also a challenge, you might even say a warning in the text. And so I thought it would fit today. So we're going to talk about the parable of the new wineskins. Jesus says this in Luke, and he says it in different ways in Mark and Matthew. He says, "No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put in new wineskins, or fresh wineskins." The setting of this parable is Luke chapter 5. And Luke chapter 5 is a rapid fire survey of lives being transformed. It begins with the story of the earliest disciples, of Simon Peter and his gang of fellow fishermen. And they're struggling to catch fish, and Jesus gives them instructions, and then they catch more fish than they can possibly imagine. And Jesus tells him at the end of that story that you were fishermen, but I'm going to make you fishers of men, of people, of humanity. Their lives were transformed. Then there was the beggar who had leprosy, who Jesus healed. His life was transformed. There's the story of the paralytic on the mat, the story where the room and the house was so crowded but the friends wanted to bring this man, their friend, to Jesus. So they laid him through the opening in the ceiling, and Jesus healed them. And in the midst of that, he made a statement: your sins are forgiven. And that caused some bristling by some of the authorities there. We'll get to that too. Levi, or Levi, your namesake, perhaps. He was a tax collector, and he had a change of heart, a change of life. Jesus called him, said, "Follow me," and he did. And he finds himself throwing this big banquet, and that's the setting of this parable, where Jesus then tells us what we're about to hear. So it's a parable, or it's a chapter, it's a narrative of lives being transformed. But it's also a chapter, a narrative of resistance and tension and skepticism and resistance. Peter, who became this fisher of men, said to Jesus, "Get away from me. For Lord, I am a sinful man." There's a sense of this transformation threatening his sense of himself. As good as it is, or as exciting, as promising as it is. So you hear some pushback. The leper, this perhaps is a little bit of a stretch, but he was told by Jesus not to tell anybody what had happened. But the gospel reports that because of this man's healing, more and more people got to see what was going on. And so I'm going to infer, in this frame of interpretation, that the leper didn't do exactly what Jesus said, or didn't exactly agree with this instruction to keep quiet. Or maybe he couldn't help it. He was walking, just his very, very presence changed people's perceptions. The Pharisees, of course, resisting Jesus at every step of the way. When he healed the paralytic on the mat and said, "Your sins are forgiven," they freaked out and said, "Wait, how can you profess to have the authority to do that? And why are you eating with tax collectors and sinners? Why would you do that? How can you do that?" This is where, in this place of transformation and resistance, that we hear how Jesus responds to the Pharisees' questions to disciples. And that's where we get into our text. And I'd like, does everybody have this handout? So there's the two sides. The one side has the three gospels, the other side just has the full text. So I would like for us just to attend to it, because I know you all surely read the passage before you came, because you read the email and do this advanced work. So the front row people did, I'm sure. I would like, is there anyone who would be willing to read this out loud for us? Anne would, great. Thank you, Anne. Yeah, we're going to read the long one. So why don't we, you got it? How's your voice today? All right.
After this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi gave a great banquet for him in his house, and there was a large crowd of tax collectors and others sitting at a table with them. The Pharisees and their scribes were complaining to his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Then they said to him, "John's disciples, like the disciples of the Pharisees, frequently fast and pray, but your disciples eat and drink." Jesus said to them, "You cannot make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them, can you? The days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and sews it to an old garment. Otherwise, the new will be torn, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says, the old is good.
The word of the Lord. Thanks.
Thanks
be
be
to
to
God.
God.
Hey, Blink. So Anne, thank you for reading. Like a good former teacher, she fills the room. Excellent. So there we go. There's where we are. Jesus is standing up for his disciples as they eat and drink and be merry in his presence. The Pharisees, though, are all about the fasting. And we might ask the question, is this about fasting? Is Jesus calling into question the practice of abstaining from food for spiritual sake? And I'm seeing some no's, and that's right. I mean, he's not. At least I don't think so. The Pharisees, their practice was to fast twice a week. That was their thing. So they're pretty invested. Two out of the what we call 7 days, they're not having food. So they think others should do the same. The early church in Acts, which was written by Luke, we know that fasting was part of their life together. So fasting is part of the tradition in the Old Testament, the Day of Atonement, the day of fasting. We know that the Old Testament scriptures attest to fasting in places of mourning. Picture Job in his sackcloth and after all of his losses and his fasting. Fasting was something that the prophets would do as they prepared to receive divine revelation. Jesus is not necessarily throwing all of that away when he pushes back against the Pharisees. Jesus seems to be more attuned to, more invested in the timing. It's all about the timing. You wouldn't fast at a banquet. You wouldn't fast at a wedding celebration. When the bridegroom is there while the dance floor is active, it's a time to eat and rejoice and take in. It's later, Jesus seems to be saying, when I'm gone, that will be the occasion perhaps to fast. So we have here a nod to what's coming at the end of the gospel, right? Like this party is not going to be in this form forever. I'm going to be leaving you. The fasting in this present hour isn't right. It's a mismatch. It doesn't match the moment. And that's what we see in the text, especially as we look at how other gospels approach this. So those of you who've taken Larry's class, has he talked about redaction criticism? Maybe he has, and yes, I'm good. I'm good. That's good. That's good. That means it's not review.
Must have been in the second hour.
Right, it was in the second hour, exactly. Right. What do we think of when we hear redaction in this context, as in DC? When we hear something that's redacted, what do we typically?
A document. It would be edited.
Edited document. Why is it edited?
So the information that is taken out sensitive,
Yeah,
confidential.
right. Get out the classified stuff or
Right.
the stuff that doesn't serve the purpose of whoever wants the document to be read.
Right.
It's X'd out. It's cut. In this case, redaction doesn't carry the same connotation. It's more about how a document is edited, how it's put together. What are the editorial decisions that the gospel writer makes in order to tell the story? What message does the storyteller want to hear? So this is something we learned a lot in seminary. I lost my 3-punch hole. punch old wine? It's like all my papers are flying all over here. It's one of those things where I think somebody took it, but no, it's certainly me. But right now I'm in the place like, who took my 3-hole punch? So what we learned in seminary, and I imagine they're still teaching it, and it's still talked about, the redaction criticism presupposes what we call the two-source hypothesis of the Gospels. And that hypothesis assumes, and this is not proven, but it's a guiding way of looking at the text that is still accepted. It assumes a certain order and a certain attribution. It assumes that the Gospel of Mark came first, that was the earliest gospel written, somewhere in like the 50s or 60s AD. And that Matthew and Luke took from Mark. When I say took, the language, the stories, the sayings, and also from a second source that they call Q, because they don't know what it is, but they looked at where I think it's like 58% of Mark is in Matthew, and in Luke it's a higher percentage. They take the sayings, they take the stories, and they presume that, okay, because Matthew and Mark have expounded on it, it's longer, or they've made editorial decisions. It just looks like, and it seems like Mark was the earliest gospel, and that Matthew and Luke took from Mark. So we're going to use that operating hypothesis today. You have a page full of the grounds for some redaction. To look at this passage relative to how the other gospel writers present it. So on the left, you'll see the Luke version. And we're going to compare Luke and Mark here for a moment. First thing you might notice is that Luke is the only one that calls it a parable. Is that important? I don't know. There's a hint of that maybe later, where we find, what is a parable? It's a story that Jesus tells using everyday worldly things, but in a way that kind of overturns everyday worldly understanding to teach. And so maybe this does do that. Look at the way, though, and we're going to focus on the garment part, which is that top paragraph. So in Mark, he's talking about the unshrunk cloth on an old cloak. You don't sew a piece of the fresh onto the old, because the patch is going to be pulled away and there's going to be a worse tear. Luke is in that frame, but there's a different emphasis. So in Luke, he talks about no one taking a piece from the old garment and putting on the old, because the new will be torn. But look at that last line. The piece from the new will not match the old. So in Luke, it's more about the match, the mismatch between the old and the new. And that's where I think this story of the wedding feast and to fast during the feast would be a mismatch. It doesn't fit. There's the reformers in our tradition. When I say reformers, like the Protestant Reformation, would sometimes use this text to say, look, the Jewish law, that's the old wineskin. That's the old wine. And Jesus is grace. And you don't match the old with the new. So there was this kind of like overturning of Jewish practice under some strains of interpretation. But this is more about the mismatch of, not that the gospel is a mismatch to the law, but it's going to reframe the law. There's going to be a change in the midst of it. And I think the interpretation that this represents a throwing away of the Jewish law, or throwing away of the Jewish practice, is overstating it and actually doesn't attend to what is in the text itself. So we've got the garment. Let's go to the part about the wine. And you'll see that the accounts in Mark and Luke are pretty close. that there's just an allusion to the fact that you're not going to put new wine in an old wineskin. And here's the physics of it, right? The new wine is going to ferment, and the gases from the fermentation are going to create pressure that on the old wineskin would cause it to tear. But the imagery is a little different too here. So in Mark, it talks about how the wine is going to be lost. You see that on the right side? It says the wine will burst the skins and the wine is lost. In Luke, what's the word that he uses instead of lost? Destroyed and spilled. Yeah. Spilled is, it's just, there's an imagery to it, right? It's a bit more evocative. And especially to those of us who have been like immersed in Christian liturgy, when we hear spilled, we might hear something that rings true to our worship. And I wonder if anybody have an idea what that might be? Rebecca does. Go for it, Rebecca. Go ahead. Spilled. All right. Poured out. I wasn't even going to go there. That's great. So yeah. So when we pour the pitcher, right? Is that what you mean? The pouring of the water? It's poured out. Yep. And Jesus' blood. Jesus' blood. Right. The other sacrament that we, this cup is the new coffee. The old this cup is the new covenant sealed in my blood, spilled for the forgiveness of sins. And I did check, like the verb here is the same verb. This verb spilled is that verb that later Jesus would use in other places to talk about his own blood being spilled. So we have that. So let's hold on to that. There are a few debates, we've talked about the debate about fasting. And this really gets to where we are with the whole idea of this is a new season. Is this a text that emphasizes or celebrates the new or the old? Just quick show of hands, like if you had to answer that question, who thinks it's celebrating the new?
Luke or Mark?
All of them, but yeah, sure, Luke. Yeah, Luke. New, all right, a celebration of new, all right. Celebration of old, anyone? Okay. Some of the olds, right? Okay. Not sure or in between yeah, exactly. There's a concern, obviously there is a concern for the new, right? There's a concern that the new garment is going to be torn on the top. So, no, we don't want to do this because it's going to rip the new garment. There's a concern for the new wine being lost, right? So we're all for that. We have this, I think, bias, or we have this voice in Scripture about newness that I am about to do a new thing. Do you not perceive it? Says the prophet Isaiah, speaking for God. There's Jeremiah who says, "The days are surely coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel." And that's supposed to be good news, right? Sing to the Lord a new song, right? In our assurance of pardon that you hear often here, what do we say? The old life is gone and the new life has just begun. So clearly there is a sense here that Jesus is talking about the new in such a way that's good, that's life-giving, that's hopeful. We're about the new, which is, I think, why I would have raised my hand with those of you who said this celebrates the new. But then if we go back to this redaction criticism thing again and look at the story and see how it compares differently, there's this odd text, this odd line at the very end. So Jesus is talking about the new, and that we want to preserve the new and don't mess with the new. But no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, but says the old is good. Any of us here who know wine, and Jesus clearly knew his wine, or he knew what everybody else knew about wine, is that the old stuff is the good stuff, right? He talks about this in John 2, in another gospel, totally different, but there's the wedding at Cana. Jesus' first miracle. And what does he do? He turns the water into wine. And he says, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, right? So clearly Jesus knows that there's a sense that like the kingdom of heaven, is the kingdom of heaven a $10 bottle of Chardonnay that I can get at Costco? Or that, 3-figure bottle of Bordeaux that you might get at Wine and Uncorked or whatever the place is down by on Bradley? I think, I don't think Jesus is saying that the kingdom of heaven is like bad, cheap wine, right? But this last line that only Luke has kind of throws into our question, well, what about the old? Is this about new replacing the old, or is there something else happening here? So we have this sentence here that we have to deal with. What are we going to do with it? One commentator, and I like this, sees this as Jesus being wry and humorous, and he's basically just showing how people are really wedded to the new. That if you like the old, you just can't take the new stuff, right? Newfangled things. Maybe that's us here, right?
Yeah.
We like our pipe organ, keep the drums out of the sanctuary. Sometimes, certain kinds of things. We're not that snatchy, but people who had the old, what is this new stuff? We don't need the new. The old stuff is better. And so Jesus is using this line to sort of point that out. Like, of course, the Pharisees, of course, people are going to stick with the old because that's what they know and it's better. Old wine is more expensive, right? You have to pay more for it. So one commentator thought this maybe is Jesus sort of poking a finger at, the wealthy. Like if you have a lot of money and you can buy the good stuff, of course you're not going to want to have this new wine. You're going to stick with the old. I don't know. That's fine. That's a good interpretation, and I think we could run with that. That's true. It names something that's true about human nature. But I think that maybe there's another way we might approach it, and I'm not sure if how much of this is Patrick. Nobody actually wrote this in what I've read in preparing for this class, but I'm sure I didn't make it up. So take it as you will. I think Jesus here is not valuing old or valuing new, but just telling us what's going to happen or what happens when old and new are brought together. And there's going to be a break. The kingdom of heaven is here, and there's just going to be consequences to that. There's going to be tension. There's going to be pressure, fermentation. There's going to be breakage. There's going to be spillage. It's a statement of reality rather than you have to do this. Yeah, Bernard.
A lot of this never made sense to me until I started making wine. And when you make wine, you learn something, and all of a sudden, a whole thing that you haven't mentioned makes sense. And that is, why are people putting wine in wine skins, whatever that is?
Sure.
Bags, when the Romans, at the very same time, were putting it in jars.
Okay.
And the reason is that the new wine isn't fermented, you're correct, and it's going to produce a lot of gas as it ferments. And therefore, this was deliberately cheap wine that the peasants would buy.
Okay.
Because they knew they would drink it before it would burst the skin. And they knew if it were in a jar, it would burst the jar. And having made lots of wine and beer over my lifetime, I've given people bottles of beer that have exploded in their refrigerator because I had to correctly measure the alcohol content.
And left room.
And these people did not know how to measure the alcohol content. They knew when the wine was okay to drink.
Oh, they didn't have the luxury of letting.
But with the modern chemistry, you can measure the alcohol content and know that you're at an alcohol level that will kill the yeast.
Okay.
And if the yeast are dead, they can't ferment it.
Right.
So basically, Jesus is talking to peasants, not the Romans whatsoever. Romans would think this is a very peculiar thing to think about, because their wine all came in jars.
Yeah, okay.
And so this is again an example of Jesus was a common person speaking to common people about common things that they would have related to.
That's fascinating. The fact that, I mean, that actually fits with the interpreter too, who's talking about the Jesus kind of digging at the rich a little
So
bit.
he might have made wine also.
Yeah, who knows? Well, he did in John chapter 2. He did. Yeah, Judy.
As I read this or listen to this, it seems to be that he has to protect the new. Because if he just tries to put the new in with the old, it's gonna destroy the new. And so if he's giving us new stuff, he's gonna have to protect it.
Okay.
And he can't just mush it together with all the old stuff, because that's gonna destroy the new stuff.
That's going to, okay.
Yeah, so he's saying, all this new stuff that I'm gonna give you, I have to protect that from some of that old stuff. It's good, the old stuff's good, but I have to protect the new, so I can't just patch it on to the old or put it into the vessels that contain.
It's so valuable. It's so important. It's so,
Yeah, and it's, but
And
it's
vulnerable.
It's also vulnerable, yeah. It's vulnerable because, and I have to protect it. If I do what you're thinking I should do, it's gonna be destroyed.
how would we put that in the context of fasting then? And so this new, the question about whether it's time to fast or not and the mismatch.
I'm not sure how that fits with fasting, but.
Yeah, like is the new practice of eating something so fragile because it goes against the sort of mindset of,
Well, the fasting was
Hopelessness.
part of the law, right? It's part of
Yep.
the ritual. It's part of the rituals in the law of the old religion,
yeah,
which has been good, but what I'm gonna tell you is gonna be new, it's gonna be different, and the time for fasting will come, but right now is not the time.
right now. We don't want to mess with the time we have now.
And we've got to do, and I've got something I have to do now while I'm here with you. because
Yeah.
I'm the bridegroom, and I'm here with you,
Huh.
and we have to do it now while I'm here, and we can't be fasting.
During that time, because it's gonna
Yeah.
tear at the new.
Because that would damage what I
Wow.
accomplished.
Okay,
That's how I hear it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I hear a lot of nods of like, that sounds right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. Yeah.
I think we have a question.
On the right, I'll come back. We're just gonna go right and left. We're very, ecumenical here. So we'll go. right.
Well, I was gonna say same thing. The whole parable to me is not about old versus wineskins or anything else. He is addressing that if it's new, we have to address the new. And if you can't address the new wine, then it's not, you have to go back to the old. New brings change, and that's what to me, is saying that if you want the new wine, you have to address the problems with new wine.
Okay. So it's
And
a,
that's different from going back and saying, why is the old wine better? It's because we haven't addressed what you have to do to make the new wine as good or better.
so there's a goal here, which is to say,
His teaching is to address, when there's new things, you have to lay certain rules for the new things. You have to address the new things to go forward.
which I'm hearing a connection with what Judy said too,
Yeah.
like that new thing is vulnerable, but it's a focus on
If you want to accept the new, you have to change.
you have to change. And it's attention to that, like put your emphasis on the new.
Right. It's not, to me, he's not talking about wine at all. It's talking about everything else.
Everything else. He's using wine, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go, then I'll go back to Roger. I'm gonna go here and then Roger, yeah.
Well, just the last two comments, I think I'm saying the same thing, but I'm hearing that the importance of new and old and the togetherness of the new and the old. I mean, without maybe mixing them.
So maybe it protects both of them.
Right, or there's a need and, well, at least a value for both.
There's Jesus isn't picking one over the other necessarily. Well, maybe there's a little bit of a question, I think, in the room even too. Is there
I know.
is it about the new? We got to get the new,
Well, when the new comes, does the old doesn't, we have to go away because the new is there and we embrace the new.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean the old doesn't have value.
We're not wiping away everything that the old gives us.
And everybody already values the old, the people he's talking to. But I've got something new for you. And as he said.
Well, is there some, and I may be missing it, but does he say somewhere, and now we leave behind us the old?
No,
No,
See, that's why, that's why I'm saying they kind of
That's what I'm saying.
I was sensing they sort of coexist.
right, yeah, yeah, and I'm not sure, I'll have to check, I'm not sure he said that in Luke per se, I'd be interested to see if that, there's this statement, I'll go to you, Roger, here in a second, but Jesus says, I'm not here to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Not one jot or tittle of the law will be overthrown until the kingdom of heaven comes. I know that's in Matthew, where Jesus is on the Sermon on the Mount, he says that. I'm not sure if he says that phrase in Luke, would it be interesting? Roger.
I was just gonna say that my mother used to turn this parable upside down when I was a child. She'd buy a nice new French loaf, beautiful crusty loaf, but we had to eat the old first. And by that time,
Okay.
that lovely loaf was
Turned
over.
into the old stuff, yeah, it does turn it around, right, that bread isn't as good.
Yeah, but it's not like,
French toast is what it's good for. That's
what is that?
yeah. What do they call that in England? Do they go? Ted,
well, I was just gonna say, in Matthew, I think he's more direct in his last sentence. He says both are preserved.
look at that. Yeah,
Because I had something else.
So we're not throwing out the old to bring in the new.
yeah, and that really much fits the not one jot of the law will go away.
We're keeping the
We're
old,
keeping the old
but adding the new.
and the new, yeah, infusing the new into the old. Yeah. But preservation of both is important.
Right.
Yeah.
Patrick, one thing I want to go way back to is we do celebrate the new year. It's called Advent, the start of the church year.
The chart, there you go. That's
Thank
true.
you.
That's a better answer than the one I texted my friend Rushi. So I'm gonna, I was like, my friend Roger has a better answer than the one I gave. Emily.
I think I have some weird perspective on this because I do change management for a living, so I hear this dilemma all the time. Like,
You
here's
live
a
it.
technology system, or here's a new work chart.
Bless you.
So it was, to me, it wasn't necessarily the either or, that the new is the new. And it really isn't gonna fit well with the old because it's new, and it doesn't make the old bad, it's just new. So it's on, to me, I took it more factual of, the new is what it is and the old is what it is, and they don't have to negate each other. They can be in a space, or you can embrace the new and respect the old,
Mhm.
because the new doesn't make the other one necessarily bad, it is just.
New. Do you, in that realm, do you attend to the interplay though? Because the reality is the two have to coexist, or there's going to be.
For a while, because eventually you'll drink the old wine and it will be gone. But since we like to make merry here previously in the scripture, but so some of it is a shift that takes place, but there's a time and space where they both will exist together. And then usually there is some kind of shift or integration, or one fades away because the other one begins to take hold, but there is a time and space where they are both there.
They're both there. Yeah. I'm gonna go Martha Best, and then Marty, and then did I see somebody over here, Amy?
I did, but she sort of said what I thought.
Oh, okay. Well, good. Thanks. Martha Best.
I just think we've lived this in the church in view of our liturgy. In my lifetime, we have gone back and reclaimed the liturgy, the ancient pieces of the liturgy that didn't exist when I was a child. I didn't even know what Advent was growing up. And it's not just the seasons, but other pieces of our worship liturgy that are ancient. I never sang a Kyrie. Did any of you growing up when you were 8, where we sing it? We weren't. But we've gone back and said there was a richness about the old that needs to be brought into the new. They were so diligent about throwing out everything Catholic at the time of the Reformation, and now we're just still picking up those pieces that make our worship even more rich as we incorporate them into our new way of worshiping.
Yep. So there's that's an argument, not an argument for the old, but there's an appreciation for the vintage that we don't want to lose. I need to go to Marty. I'm sorry. Marty.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, my point was, I guess I was gonna say, I think it depends on the circumstances. For example,
Hmm.
obviously, a computer is much more useful than a manual typewriter, as long as you have electricity and somebody can repair it.
Yep.
Same way, an electric sewing machine is much more useful as long as you have electricity and somebody to repair it. So it depends on the circumstances as to which is the most useful gospel at the time.
So that's a little bit of the timing issue, the miss, you don't fast during the wedding.
Yeah.
That you fast at the other season. So, yeah. So it's contextual. Okay. Roger, and then I'm
On
gonna,
this topic, just to mention that the Anglican Church hymnal is called Hymns Ancient and Modern.
okay,
And I never really understand what that means, but
yeah.
it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, I don't think.
Well, it does a little bit. I mean, we have these hymns in our hymnal that we sing that we hear them as like they're the old traditional hymns. Right?
Yeah.
There was a time when people were like, "What is this hymn?"
Yeah.
You know, this
Okay.
is new, right? So the new becomes the old in some
Mhm.
respects. So a little bit to your point about the wine and how it's made. So what is a wineskin made of?
A bladder. It would have been a
Okay.
bladder of an animal.
An animal. It's or a skin of an animal. I mean, it could be. I think it could have been leather skin.
Well, I
I'm
think
not sure.
back in the day,
They actually
it
took the
was
bladder.
wax.
Okay, yeah, but it was from an animal, right?
Mhm.
Any
Probably a goat,
goat or lamb or sheep, Huh.
sheepskin, yep.
lamb and
Mhm.
sheep.
Mhm.
What does that ring in the Christian church? Lamb and sheep. Yeah, I am Jesus is the Lamb of God.
Mhm.
Yeah. So in addition, in the midst of all these great interpretations too, I think Jesus is talking about himself in some respects and about what it's going to be like for his disciples and the church as they proceed through his life, that his presence in this world is going to be like a new, like a wineskin. The old is going to have, there's going to be a tear. There's going to be a spill. And those transformed lives in Matthew or Luke 5, they all experience something like that, this sort of breakage of the old. As the new comes into their life, the old is going to have to wrestle with it and live with it. Peter and the fishermen, they had this whole new thing, right? That very much incorporated the old, but boy, didn't it mess with their old life? Their old relationships, how they were perceived by their family, their business model, everything changed, Emily, like organizational, missional change as a result of this new. And certainly there was some breakage and some spillage there. The leper who was healed, maybe, for him, he had this whole new body, right? And he could walk and be part of society in a way that he was excluded before all this. Think about what it was like for the people who only knew him as a leper, who only knew him as somebody to feel sorry for, or who made them feel guilty as they passed by every day. Oh, yeah, I'll give you some money this time, but I can't do it every day. You know how we feel, right? Have you ever had a colleague who is on your level organizationally and then becomes your boss, or you become their supervisor? And now, our relationship is different. What we had before is gone, even though it's still kind of here. And there's going to be some breakage there. Certainly the Levi, the tax collector, who had a business model that was corrupt in some way, right? He was taking from his people, adding extra and working with the occupying forces. Now all that's called into question. His relationships have changed. His sense of self has changed. And Jesus, right? He knows where he's going. He's going to Jerusalem. There's going to be crucifixion. What happened when Christ breathed his last breath on the cross to the curtain in the temple? It ripped, right? I see some resonance there to the garment, right? There's a tear. That's not the end of the story. The end of the story is resurrection and new life, but I think Jesus is also preparing his disciples for this journey of what is going to happen when this new thing, this new gospel, enters into all the spheres of their lives, their political life, their familial life, their economic life, their spiritual practice. It's new, it's wonderful. It needs to be protected and preserved. It's for people on the margins, who couldn't afford the good stuff in the beginning. And yet it's going to create this fracture. And he's preparing his disciples for that. And I think, how are we doing on time? Yep, about 10 minutes. What do we do with all that then as the church now, as people who are in 2023, as a church that, we're going to go into worship and experience a change in our relationship with Whitney and all that she's been through. The old and the new are sitting together, and Jesus is part of that, and it's exciting, it's promising, and yet there's a pull. There's both going on at the same time. I think we're really, one of the things that comes clear to me in hearing you talk is we're invested in this new old thing, because we have parts of the old that we love and it means so much to us, and we're also drawn to this new thing, and also scared of this new thing, and also reticent to try to figure out how it's going to match up in our life. If we really take this story and live where Jesus is taking us, it's going to create that tension, right? And that's hard. So I think one of the things we take from this text is a encouragement. It's got a little bit of warning that I feel like I'm in 4/4 time. Yeah. Somebody's metronome is going. Yeah, Jude.
It seems to me too that Jesus was crucified because of the old law. They decided that under the law, he was guilty of blasphemy, and that's why he had to be put to death. So the old really came crashing into the new.
Yeah. Or was it not to push back, but was it the old itself, or people's posture towards the old?
Yes, people want to hang on to that old, and you're disrupting this. And so you've got to die. But we can find at least technicalities and interpret the things that you have said to mean that you were in violation of the law, which I don't think he was, but they interpreted it.
Yeah.
And so then it's destroyed. At least
the best of the old would accommodate and welcome the new, right?
And Joseph of Arimathea and several others that were part of that probably wouldn't have put him to death.
Right.
But the people that really hang on to their power didn't want to let go of that. They used the old law to condemn.
Think of Nicodemus as well, who wrestled with that. Like, how does this match with very much part of the old guard, but this new thing comes into it.
How can you be born again?
Born again.
That's really a challenge.
Emily.
And so you brought up Whitney, and I got to hear her this morning. And what's kind of interesting is that the full circle moment here is the key thing that she says that I wrote down, doodling in my Bible. The former things have passed, new life springs forth. So as you kind of prepped us to kind of move into the next space and think about what she might be saying in the passage, I just thought I'd share that.
The former life has passed.
New life springs
forth.
And I think when this speaks to me, these scriptures speak to me, when you talk about the old and formalized past, it's all about sacrifice, what we're willing to sacrifice. Or one for the other. At any given time.
And sometimes we're confronted with the need to sacrifice, right? Or to go with that. You could also use this as a barometer too. If you're comfortable, if life is simple, there's no tension. Maybe you're stuck on the old, that if we're not, there's a good news, bad news. Like I think we're all in our lives experiencing in some place fracture, tension, challenge. And not to say that those things were instituted by God for us, but in them, there may be what we might be experiencing is the interplay of old and new. And we need to attend to and cherish and protect the vulnerable new life. And we need to do so in a way that honors and holds what the old has, the vintage, right? The Kyrie. Maybe the new is the old, right? I mean, Kyrie, you said it. The Kyrie is new to you, but it's darn old, right? And isn't Jesus trying to bring his people forward by going back to the essence of who they are too? The people freed from slavery, the people, there's a certain sense of return that is new. Yeah.
Well, it did take us 400 years.
To
reclaim
get
some
back
of
after
those
the, right,
pieces.
exactly,
Yes.
from the Reformation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another 400 to do.
Yeah, and
What
won't
else?
it be true then too that we'll forget what the gift of the 400-year-old gift was and kind of come back to that too?
Yeah.
You know? You know what? I think that seems like a good place to end. So thank you. What was thrilling about this was, oh man, you really engaged. Thank you. This may be a sermon text in a couple weeks. We'll see. I thought, but blessings. Let's close with prayers. We enter into this new day. Lord, we pause to just breathe in the gift of the present as we consider the old and live into the new. Giving thanks for the wisdom of those seated near us, the questions and possibilities that we have explored together, the anticipation of worship and of hearing your word proclaimed, of tasting the bread and the wine that is that new covenant. Help us to welcome your new creation, to live into it, to embrace it, to protect it, to focus on it, even as it enters into a world we know, a world we've inherited, a world in which we hold on to what keeps us safe. Help us to be like your disciples and to hear Christ speaking new things in our midst, and to give us the courage and the hope to follow this story in the gospel and in our lives. And as those two come together, may we come to that glorious exclamation of he is risen. He is risen indeed. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.